Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Horizon, our weekly broadcast where we explore the intersection of markets, politics, and the human condition behind the headlines. I'm glad you're with us. Before we begin, a quick note. Next week, we'll host a live lecture on resource nationalism and the new global order, followed by a discussion of my upcoming book, The Price of the Planet. And for those asking about our previous segment on energy subsidies and climate finance, yes, the replay will be available on our channel this Friday. Now, let's turn to today's story. It begins with a quiet statement from British Columbia's provincial government, the kind of administrative update that usually passes unnoticed. But this time it carried a shockwave. The United States has paused negotiations on the Columbia River Treaty, one of the most significant cross-border water management agreements in North America. The reason given was simple. The new administration is reviewing its international engagements, yet behind those diplomatic words lies a much larger shift, one that touches on sovereignty, climate, and the moral architecture of resource sharing. At first glance, this might sound like a routine bureaucratic move. Governments change, policies reset, treaties are revisited, but listen closely and you'll hear something deeper. This pause came just as the west coast of the United States faces one of its deadliest wildfire seasons on record. In Los Angeles, flames have turned neighborhoods to ash and skies to blood orange dusk. The state's reservoirs are drying faster than they can refill. And in the midst of this crisis, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has drawn public attention to what he calls one of Canada's greatest untapped treasures. Water, he said it plainly. They have millions of gallons pouring down from the north. They have a very large faucet. That line, delivered with Trump's trademark simplicity, might have sounded like a passing remark, but it struck a raw nerve across the border, because in Canada, water is not just a resource, it is identity, culture, and sovereignty wrapped together. And when the world's most powerful country begins to talk about your rivers as if they were pipes waiting to be opened, the political ground shifts beneath your feet. Before jumping into what this means, we should recall what the Columbia River Treaty represents. Signed in 1961, it was built on the promise of shared management. Canada would construct dams for flood control and power generation, while both sides would benefit from the predictable flow of water across their borders. It was one of the great post-war symbols of cooperation between neighbors, a blueprint for balancing ecology, economics, and diplomacy. Now, 60 years later, that balance is fraying. Trump's remarks have reopened an old and uncomfortable question. Who owns the water? For most of the 20th century, water diplomacy was guided by mutual restraint. Canada resisted exporting fresh water even when pressured, and the U.S., for all its thirst, largely respected that boundary. But climate change has altered the calculus. Drought has spread like a shadow across the American West. From Arizona to Nevada, from California's Central Valley to Utah's Salt Plains, the numbers are staggering. The Colorado River now runs at only 2/3 of its historic average. Lake Mead has dropped more than 150 feet since the year 2000. Entire agricultural economies are teetering on the edge. In that context, Trump's faucet metaphor is more than political theater. It's an early sign of a potential policy direction, one that treats water as the next commodity frontier. The logic, after all, is familiar. The United States built pipelines for oil, fiber optics for data, and trade corridors for goods. Why not pipelines for water? To many in Washington, it sounds efficient. To many in Ottawa and Vancouver, it sounds ominous. Here's what that means in real terms. When water becomes a matter of cross-border negotiation, it also becomes a matter of leverage. Drought can justify demands. Economic power can shape outcomes. And before long, a shared river can turn into a strategic bargaining chip. Canada has been here before with lumber, with steel, with energy. Each time, economic dependence became a political vulnerability. That's why Ottawa's response this time was immediate and unambiguous. Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that Canada's water is not for sale. He called it a public trust, a national responsibility, not a tradable asset. His language was calm, but it carried a firmness that needed no translation. Because once you turn water into a market commodity, you lose the moral high ground that defines stewardship. It's no longer about care. It's about price. And price, as history teaches, always favors the strongest buyer. This is where the issue widens from a North American dispute to a global warning. We are entering an era when the most abundant societies are being asked to share their lifelines not out of generosity, but necessity. The United States, once a symbol of self-reliance, now faces environmental limits that test its myths of endless growth. Canada, in turn, must decide whether cooperation means compromise. That's the heart of today's story. Not water alone, but what water represents, the collision between nature's boundaries and human ambition. Let's begin with the economics, because as always, money explains what politics prefers to obscure. When Trump speaks about turning on Canada's faucet, it isn't merely rhetoric, it's a market signal. The U.S. Southwest is staring at the financial cost of drought, and the numbers are beginning to look like wartime expenditures. California's water deficit alone now translates into an estimated $9 billion in agricultural losses each year. Insurance claims from drought-related wildfires are breaking records. Municipalities are forced to purchase emergency supplies at prices once reserved for crude oil. In that light, Trump's comments sound less like fantasy and more like preemptive justification. If Washington can frame Canadian water as a strategic necessity, not a trade good, but a matter of survival, it can shift the political ground beneath any future negotiation. Necessity, after all, has been the moral shield of empire. And water, the last truly irreplaceable resource, offers an argument so powerful that even trade ethics begin to wobble. Here's where the contradiction reveals itself. The United States, long a champion of free markets and deregulation, is suddenly considering the state-directed acquisition of a foreign resource. In other words, the same administration that mocks government planning is now contemplating it on a continental scale, so long as the planning serves its own scarcity. This is called efficiency in the make-believe world of Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Canada's response follows a different logic entirely. Ottawa treats water not as capital, but as commons. It flows through the Constitution as a public good managed by provinces, not privatized through federal trade. That's not sentimentality, it's design. Canada's geography demanded cooperation long before its politics did. From the Yukon's glacial melt to Quebec's hydro dams, water is both infrastructure and inheritance. It can't be owned by any one group because it belongs symbolically and materially to everyone. But the moment Trump introduced the idea of cross-border transfer, Canadian economists began running scenarios. What would happen if even a fraction of those northern rivers were diverted south? The projections were alarming. For every billion gallons exported, local ecosystems would lose their stabilizing rhythms, wetlands would shrink, salmon migrations would falter. Hydro capacity would fluctuate, threatening industries built on cheap, renewable power. The ripple effect would reach housing, employment, and the cost of energy, turning an ecological imbalance into a social one. Before jumping further, let's remember the backdrop, the Columbia River Treaty itself. When it was signed in 1961, Canada agreed to construct 3 major dams and coordinate flow with the United States to prevent catastrophic floods and ensure predictable power generation. In return, it received what's called the Canadian entitlement, a share of the downstream benefits. It was a rare example of cooperative engineering that actually worked. Yet now, that spirit of shared management is being tested by the oldest question in capitalism. How do you price nature? In the U.S., water markets have already begun to take shape. Hedge funds and private equity firms are buying rights to aquifers in California and Texas, speculating on scarcity as the new gold rush. The logic is simple. As water becomes limited, its price will rise. Investors are positioning themselves ahead of that curve. To them, the idea of importing Canadian water isn't absurd. It's visionary. They see a continental pipeline network, a new NAFTA, not for goods, but for survival. The infrastructure bill of the century, wrapped in the language of mutual benefit. But don't be fooled by the promise of cooperation. What looks like partnership often hides dependence. Once water flows across borders under contractual terms, it becomes a commodity subject to trade law. That means disputes would no longer be settled by governments alone, but by international arbitration panels, the same courts that once let corporations sue countries for protecting their own environments. Mark Carney and his advisors know this history well. They remember how NAFTA's Chapter 11 allowed private investors to challenge Canadian environmental restrictions. The lesson was bitter. When you commodify what sustains life, you also outsource your right to protect it. So when Carney says Canada's water is not for sale, it's not a slogan, it's a defensive policy. It draws a red line between stewardship and surrender. And for many Canadians, that red line is sacred because they've watched what happens when the line blurs. Look at Australia, where water trading began as a tool for efficiency. Within 2 decades, it created a speculative bubble that priced small farmers out of their own irrigation rights. Water became a financial asset, its flow determined not by need, but by yield. Rivers ran dry even as trading desks lit up with profit. That's the cautionary tale hovering over North America now. Once you introduce market logic into the water cycle, you transform it forever. There is no easy way back. Economists call it path dependence. History calls it hubris. Now let's step back from the policy briefings and look at the human landscape. The debate over the Columbia River, or the so-called water pipeline, isn't abstract. It's already shaping lives in the parched orchards of California, in the flooded fields of British Columbia, and in the corporate boardrooms of Washington and Ottawa. Each side is calculating what survival will mean in the century of drought. To those whose daily lives trace the shifting geography of this debate. Picture for a moment 2 communities separated by a border but united by anxiety. In California's Central Valley, a farmer stands in a field of withered almonds, watching the soil crack like broken pottery. His water allocations have been cut again, this time by half. Wells are running dry. He's seen headlines about Canadian rivers and wonders, not out of greed but desperation, whether relief might flow from the north. Meanwhile, in a small town along British Columbia's Kootenay River, a hydropower worker reads the same headlines and feels a different kind of dread. He knows those rivers, their strength, their fragility. He knows that what looks like abundance from afar is actually balance, a delicate harmony of snowmelt, rainfall, and seasonal flow that sustains both ecosystems and economies. For him, Trump's words, they have a very large faucet, sound less like observation and more like invasion. This is the human face of resource politics. One side prays for access, the other fears extraction, and both are caught in the same planetary squeeze. A climate system shifting faster than any political negotiation can keep up. The tragedy is that instead of building shared resilience, the rhetoric of ownership and entitlement is hardening into confrontation. Here's what that tells us. Scarcity doesn't create cooperation automatically. It can also breed hierarchy, the illusion that those with power deserve more of what remains. The United States, accustomed to abundance, now faces the kind of environmental constraint that poorer nations have endured for decades. Its instinct, shaped by empire, is to look outward for solutions rather than inward for reform. That's the irony of this moment. A superpower that once exported oil and ideology may soon become an importer of water. Let's not forget, this isn't the first time North America flirted with the idea of moving water across borders. In the 1980 seconds, the Grand Canal proposal envisioned redirecting rivers from James Bay southward to the Midwest and Southwest. It promised to turn wastewater into prosperity. Engineers loved it. Economists questioned it. Environmentalists fought it. Ultimately, it died under the weight of its own ambition and the quiet realization that nature doesn't obey economic blueprints. Yet here we are again, resurrecting old dreams in a hotter, drier century. Mark Carney's position that water is a public trust challenges this repetition. It asserts that certain boundaries must hold, not for national pride, but for ecological survival. His statement that water is the foundation of sovereignty carries historical weight. After all, sovereignty once meant the power to feed one's population, to protect one's borders, to provide for one's people. In a climate-constrained world, sovereignty may soon mean something simpler, the ability to keep one's taps running. By the way, the moral dimension of this debate should not be underestimated. When a nation begins to treat water as a tradable good, it implicitly accepts that access to life itself can be rationed by wealth. That logic doesn't end with Canada and the US. It extends globally. Already, investment banks are developing water futures on commodity exchanges. Investors can now bet on the price of scarcity, the way traders once bet on oil or wheat. The language of finance is creeping into the language of survival. We live in a system that creates crisis, then monetizes the cure. The same economic model that drove fossil fuel dependence now seeks to profit from drought management. Corporations that once sold energy now market desalination plants, purification patents, and privatized water grids. It's a perfect circle, a feedback loop of dependency dressed as innovation, and the irony is almost unbearable. The more the planet burns, the more valuable water becomes, and the more attractive it looks as a business opportunity. Don't be fooled by the talk of mutual benefit. History shows that when essential resources cross borders under corporate terms, democracy tends to shrink. Decisions shift from parliaments to trade tribunals, from citizens to shareholders. The same mechanism that made cheap oil seem indispensable could soon make water diplomacy non-negotiable. Once pipelines are built, they require contracts. Contracts require guarantees, and guarantees inevitably require enforcement, political, legal, even military. That's how resource sharing becomes resource control. Carney's warning then isn't just ecological, it's constitutional. He's reminding Canadians, and by extension all nations, that sovereignty is not only about territory, it's about moral jurisdiction, the right to decide what remains sacred, what cannot be bought or sold. Once that principle erodes, the rest follows easily. Now compare this to the American narrative taking shape. U.S. policy thinkers, particularly in the conservative energy sector, frame Canada's refusal as selfishness. They argue that the two nations share a continent, a climate, and an economy, so why not share the water? It's a seductive argument, one that dresses extraction as partnership. But beneath it lies a deeper habit, the tendency of power to redefine fairness according to need. When the strong require what the weak possess, moral reasoning becomes negotiable. That's why this debate matters far beyond the 49th parallel. It's not just a bilateral disagreement, it's a test case for how advanced democracies handle the collision between environmental necessity and economic ideology. Will they reinvent cooperation based on limits or repeat the old cycle of exploitation under new slogans? For now, both nations are standing firm. The U.S. reviews its treaties, Canada guards its rivers. But make no mistake, the drought won't wait for diplomacy. Each year, the snowpacks shrink. Each summer, the wildfires grow taller. Each election cycle, the promises to study the issue sound thinner. Eventually, necessity may force action, and when that moment comes, the side that controls the source will also control the future. Let's continue by zooming out to the geopolitical canvas where this story truly belongs. The standoff between Ottawa and Washington over water is not an isolated quarrel. It's part of a larger global pattern, a quiet reordering of power based not on ideology or weapons, but on the geography of survival. In the 20th century, nations rose and fell by access to oil. In the 21st, it will be by access to water. And in that emerging map of scarcity, Canada occupies a position it never sought, that of a reluctant superpower. Consider this paradox. Canada holds almost 20% of the world's fresh water, yet struggles to provide clean drinking water to dozens of indigenous communities within its own borders. That contradiction exposes a deeper truth. Abundance doesn't guarantee equity. Managing water requires justice, not just geography. Prime Minister Carney knows this well, which is why his defiance toward Washington carries a domestic echo. Before exporting water abroad, he argues, Canada must secure dignity at home. In other words, sovereignty begins with accountability. Meanwhile, in the United States, political debate over water has taken on a familiar tone, part denial, part desperation. On one side, climate scientists warn that the Southwest's mega drought could persist for decades, reshaping migration, agriculture, and energy grids. On the other, lobbyists frame the crisis as a logistical challenge, something solvable through infrastructure and trade. The result is a strange blend of panic and profit motive. When Trump speaks of a faucet in the north, he transforms a planetary emergency into a construction project. The message is clear: don't adapt, acquire. This, of course, is the same mentality that drove fossil fuel expansion for a century. When coal ran low, we drilled oil. When oil became controversial, we fracked gas. And now, as water runs short, we look north. The cycle repeats because the system demands growth, even if the resource in question is the very foundation of life. The economic machine cannot slow down, even when doing so might save it. That is the tragic rhythm of capitalism in the age of climate collapse. Extract, exhaust, and move on. Yet not all Americans see water as a commodity. In fact, a growing movement within the U.S. is pushing back community cooperatives in New Mexico, indigenous nations along the Colorado River, and even some city councils in California are declaring water a human right, not a market product. They're rejecting the narrative that scarcity must be solved through privatization. Their argument is radical only because it's rational. The way to survive the climate era is not by annexing your neighbor's resources, but by rebuilding your own systems to respect natural limits. Let's pause on that. Natural limits, a phrase almost forgotten in modern economics. For decades, political leaders have treated limits as failures of imagination. But the truth is, limits are what keep societies stable. Rivers have limits. Aquifers have limits. Even cooperation has limits. The art of governance lies in recognizing them before catastrophe does it for you. That's what makes this water dispute such a defining moment. It's not about pipelines or treaties. It's about whether nations still have the courage to say enough. Now, let's touch on history. In the 1930 seconds Dust Bowl, entire communities in the American Midwest were uprooted because soil and water were treated as infinite. Industrial agriculture plowed until nothing was left. The same mentality governs today's water policy. We drain rivers to sustain industries that were never designed for deserts. Then, when nature retaliates, we look outward for rescue. The pattern is almost poetic in its repetition, except the ending this time could be irreversible. Carney's framing of water as a national defense issue isn't exaggeration. When resources run low, alliances weaken. Cooperation between friends can become coercion between rivals. Already, international analysts are noting how the language around the Columbia River Treaty has shifted from mutual benefit to strategic interest. That's not diplomacy, that's deterrence. And deterrence over water is a phrase we should all find chilling. Think of it this way. The global economy was built on the assumption of stable climate and abundant supply. Remove either, and every equation begins to unravel. Inflation, migration, conflict, they all start here with the elements. That's why the conversation about water is not just environmental, it's existential. By the way, Trump's pause on the treaty negotiations is being sold as a review of international engagements, but the subtext is simpler. The administration wants leverage. Pausing talks creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates pressure, and pressure makes allies pliable. It's the oldest diplomatic trick in the book. But this time, it's being used not over tariffs or weapons, but over rivers. The tactic may win short-term headlines, but it deepens long-term distrust. The irony, as always, is that both countries depend on each other more than either will admit. The U.S. needs Canada's water for stability. Canada needs the U.S. market for prosperity. Here's the deeper lesson. Climate change doesn't create new borders. It exposes the fragility of the old ones. The 49th parallel was drawn by surveyors who never imagined drought maps or melting glaciers. But as temperatures rise, political boundaries will mean less than hydrological ones. The rivers will redraw the map for us, whether we cooperate or not. Before we close, let's return to the beginning, to that quiet statement from British Columbia that the United States has paused negotiations on the Columbia River Treaty. It sounded technical, harmless, temporary, But as we've seen, this pause is not a diplomatic breath. It's a symptom of something larger, a world where scarcity is overtaking stability and where the language of partnership is being replaced by the logic of possession. Let's look beyond the headlines. The Columbia River, stretching more than 2,000 kilometers from the Rockies to the Pacific, has long symbolized cooperation. Its flow is shared, its power divided, its stewardship negotiated. Yet now it stands at the center of a philosophical collision, not just between two governments, but between two ways of understanding the earth itself. One sees nature as a storehouse of commodities waiting to be extracted. The other sees it as a living system to which we belong. That's the real fault line beneath this debate. Trump's large faucet metaphor, crude as it sounded, captures a deeper cultural instinct, the belief that every problem can be engineered, every shortage solved by tapping into someone else's supply. It's the same worldview that built empires and pipelines, the same faith in technology that fueled centuries of expansion. But what happens when the frontier runs out, when the resource in question is not oil or gold, but water, the bloodstream of the planet? That's when old logic meets its limit. Mark Carney's defiance, "Canada's water is not for sale," echoes far beyond Ottawa. It's not nationalism, it's realism. It's an acknowledgement that sovereignty in the 21st century no longer rests on military borders or trade balances, but on ecological control, the ability to provide clean water, to sustain agriculture, to preserve rivers. That is the new currency of power. And for Canada, guarding that currency is not arrogance, it's survival. But the real question isn't whether Canada will sell its water, it's whether humanity can learn to live within the boundaries of a finite planet. Because what's unfolding across North America is a rehearsal for the conflicts to come in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. The World Bank estimates that by 2050, water scarcity could displace 700 million people. The phrase water wars, once dismissed as dystopian fiction, now appears in military briefings. Think about that. The next global crisis may not begin with tanks crossing borders, but with rivers running dry. We need to remember water is not a privilege. It's the precondition of every society, every economy, every democracy. When it becomes a commodity, democracy itself begins to erode because whoever controls the supply controls the future. The moral of this story isn't about the Columbia River. It's about what kind of civilization we intend to be, one that measures value in markets or one that measures it in stewardship. Let's not be naive. The pressures of climate change will test every government, every treaty, every assumption of abundance. As drought deepens in the American West, as glaciers retreat in the North, as global demand for fresh water doubles by mid-century, the temptation to treat water as trade will grow irresistible. But history leaves us with a warning. Once a resource becomes currency, compassion becomes collateral. In the end, this is not a story about Canada or the United States. It's a mirror reflecting us all, our habits of consumption, our illusions of control, our unwillingness to confront the mathematics of a finite world. The Columbia River dispute is only the opening act in a century-long drama, one that will decide whether we learn to share the planet or fight over its remnants. So as we close tonight's broadcast, let's ask the question no treaty can settle. Can modern economies built on endless growth adapt to a world defined by limits, or will they try one last time to buy what cannot be bought: time, water, survival itself? Thank you for joining us. I look forward to speaking with you again next week.